Welcome to Your College Bound Kid,
a podcast for parents, college counselors, students, and anyone who wants a weekly deep dive into the world of college admissions.
My name is Lynda, and I'm originally from Michigan, now living in the St. Louis metro area. I'm a college coach with School Match for You and have a daughter at University of Chicago.
I'm Lisa, and I'm a clinical psychologist and college counselor. I have a daughter in college, a daughter in high school, and a son in middle school. After 30 years in Chicago, we recently moved to North Carolina.
My name is Mark. I'm a college coach in Atlanta and the parent of two daughters. Karis, a graduate of Davidson College, and she is the founder of the Spanish tutoring company, SpanishHelpToday.com. And Joy is a graduate of the University of Georgia, and she is getting her master's degree at North Carolina State University. Good afternoon, friends. I'm recording this a little later on a Sunday than normal. We have a few different things for you today. We start out with a continuation of the conversation Lisa and I had from Thursday, where we debated whether students should take the courses they want to take or go for the highest GPA. And Lisa reached out to me yesterday to say she feels she could have explained UNC's process a little better, so she asked if she could take a few minutes to clarify some things. And of course, I gladly obliged. I said, get it to me by noon tomorrow and we can get it on Monday's episode. And she had that thing over to me in 10 minutes. But, it happens when you talk a lot in front of the mic. You're going to say some things that you are either factually inaccurate or you don't explain very well. I remember when I said Kenyon was once a women's college, which was not correct. So I had to clarify that. I also said that the new FAFSA would be going live on December 1st instead of October. Well, it's December, but not December 1st. That was what was announced at that time. And so sometimes you just have to take a step back and clarify some things. And so I don't know if you know this because I work with Lisa on a regular basis, but she's very, very funny. And so I went in to look at the recording she had done in our system, and she titled it Lisa's Mea Culpa. So she cracks me up. But so you'll hear from Lisa initially, and then you'll also hear a SpeakPipe question that both Julie and I thought was fantastic. Comes from Northern California, and just shows the sophistication of our listeners. Lee wants to know, why does the University of Chicago have such a high yield rate? As she said, how are they doing it? She also wants to know how and if students should factor yield rates into consideration when looking at colleges. So Julie and I take a longer than normal, close to 30 minutes, to do a deep dive on that one. And then we have a brand new interview. And it's a fantastic interview. Lynda approached me around 6 months ago and said, how would you feel about me doing some interviews? Because I feel I'm ready now. And I'm happy anytime our 7 co-hosts want to take on a greater responsibility. Lisa and I have been shouldering most of the interview responsibilities, but Susan's got helped out with interviews, Julia's helped out, and Vince has as well. So I was very happy for Lynda to do that. And the interview she's doing, it's really, really good. It's about the new digital SAT that's coming really quickly. It's coming out in March. In fact, the December is the last paper administration. And the PSAT version will go into effect in October. So you're going to be hearing a lot about this in a really short period of time. And, this interview with Ben from Revolution Prep, he's a real pro, a scholar, and a really good communicator. I thought Lynda asked outstanding questions. So I've already tapped Lynda. I'm like, Lynda, can you do one on the coalition? So yeah, I think you'll be hearing more from Lynda. I thought it was just, her debut was pretty awesome. So without any further ado, we'll dive right in and you'll hear from Lisa with her clarifying comments from last week.
Hi, it's Lisa, and I am here just to clarify a couple of the comments that I made in last week's question from a listener segment with Mark, in which we discussed the idea of taking certain classes or not taking certain classes to increase a person's GPA and class rank. I first want to say that I don't think I expressed myself very clearly in this segment. Sometimes when Mark and I are talking, it's like two old friends, and there's a lot of context that we both understand that we're not fully explaining to the listeners. And I certainly think that was the case here. When I talked about UNC Chapel Hill and that it's a 10% kind of thing in terms of getting in, I did not mean to suggest that they are an admit by the numbers or an auto admit kind of school, like, for instance, universities in Texas. What I did mean to say is that in my area, which is Chapel Hill, which is right next to the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, it's generally thought that having a good class rank, like in the top 10%, is going to be more helpful to getting in than not. Of course, UNC Chapel Hill is holistic and considers a lot of other factors around class rank. And so I don't necessarily think that's true for the rest of the state. But in this area, lots and lots of people want to go to the hometown flagship school, and they just simply can't accommodate all of those students. Their mission is to serve the entire state. So I do think that there are probably some higher cutoffs. So that being said, I do know that people are gaming the class rank system around here by taking classes, at the community college, or trying to test out, or maybe dropping some art classes because they don't give as many points for their GPA. And that is a reality of the system. And I think that occurs, as far as I know, in some of the more competitive schools in Wake County, North Carolina, and certainly here in Chapel Hill. One listener who I respect greatly felt that I was sort of fanning the flames, saying that people should all compete and do this system and push their kids to the limit. And that's not what I meant to imply at all. And I'm really sorry if that's the impression that I gave, because when I was talking about my own daughter, I was being very specific to our situation. My daughter is a very competitive person by nature. That's just who she is. And she likes to be first at anything that she does. And so in that sense, I think I would, if she could academically and emotionally handle it, and she was in that system, I think that it might be something for us to consider as a family. But by no means do I think that's the right thing to do. And by no means do I think that's a good thing to do. But I do think that as college counselors and as parents, we have to be aware of the realities of the situation, however unpleasant and unsavory that they may be. And I wanted Mark to understand that it's not so simple all the time, and that there are lots of things that people have to consider when they're looking at GPA and class rank. I really appreciate the people who reached out to me. Sometimes you just don't know that what you have in your head isn't what came out of your mouth. And I really appreciate the opportunity to clarify that. Thanks so much.
And now it's time for a question from one of our listeners.
Julia joining with me today for the question from a listener. Hey, Julia.
Hi, Mark. How are you?
Good. I wanted to give Lisa a bit of a break. She's been doing so many interviews and spotlights and questions, and we're trying to go to Monday, Thursday for a while because you guys have stepped up to the plate big time. We had 74 SpeakPipe questions sent in, and we don't want you waiting half a year to get an answer. Some of them are seniors, and Julia, I picked some ones out for you that I thought you would be particularly good at answering. So no pressure.
We'll see if we agree, too. I always like to see that as well.
Yeah. Well, we'll keep it authentic either way. So without any further ado, I want to play this question that comes from Lee from Northern California.
Hi, Mark. This is Lee from NorCal. I have a yield question for you. I just discovered collegetuitioncompare.com to compare yield rates from various schools. I was struck by how low some schools were, like USC at 41%, and how high others were, like University of Chicago at 85%. The top 10 schools seem to hover around 67%, with Harvard and Stanford being the exception at 83%. How does the University of Chicago do it? Mark, what should the application strategy be around this? Do you think yield rate should be a consideration when applying to college? Thanks so much.
Okay, so this question, Lee's doing her homework. This is a question for someone that is really into college admissions, Julia. So there are a couple components to her question. She's surprised to see a USC with a 41% yield. And then the 10 most selective schools around 67% yield, with Harvard and Stanford in the 80s, and then Chicago at 85. So she kind of has a two-part question here. And she says, one, how is Chicago doing it? How did they get an 85% yield? And then their second part of her question is, should yield rates be considered when applying to college? So I was actually really excited about this question because I have one insight into how Chicago's doing it that I wouldn't have had until I visited Chicago when I was with Dave. So I visited Chicago on the 11th of July and got a chance to meet with a senior admission officer for 30 minutes afterward.
Great.
And I learned something I didn't know about them, which I'll share later. But I know you and I have had conversations about Chicago and some of the things they do to help with yield. And that's why I thought you'd be a great one to answer. So do you want to take that question first? How is Chicago doing it from your experience? But before we do, just in case there's a new listener out there who doesn't know what yield is, can you tell our listeners what yield is? And then comment on like some of the reasons why you think Chicago has such a high yield.
Sure. Yes. So yield means that if the student is admitted, that they will matriculate at that university or college, right? So in fact, there used to be sort of admissions vernacular out there, TTY, tough to yield. So that might get into part 2 of this question about do we pay attention to yield rates? I'm really curious what you found out, Mark. I will tell you I'm pretty sure my answer is correct, but it's purely anecdotal because as we all know, Chicago does not provide data that differentiates their admit rates and their ED1, ED2, and early action rounds, and also their wait list activity. So Milton Academy has an awful lot of students that attend Chicago, and nearly all of them are admitted through early decision 1. It used to be that it would be early action or ED1 was the way to go. Early action less so this day and age. ED2 is still a nice place to be for Chicago, but while I don't have the data, the only students we have ever had admitted to Chicago in the regular round came off of the wait list, and it was essentially like an ED3 situation. The student had to say yes to Chicago to be taken off the wait list. And we're aware that that's how they like to do things. So we tell students that. So we're never, ever letting Chicago know. If a student is like kind of feeling it out, we're like, yep, nope, not interested. We don't want to string you along. The other thing to note is that Chicago does an awful lot of admitting. I don't know the numbers off the wait list. So that admit rate, which is really low, might not be an accurate snapshot of how many are actually admitted because the wait list numbers don't count for that. But given
can you explain to people how the waitlist numbers don't count? Because that might be a new concept to some
Yes,
people.
every college is a little different, but I think I would venture to say the majority of colleges do not include waitlisted students who are admitted after being waitlisted as part of their data for that admitted class. So their SAT scores, their GPAs. Other pieces about them are usually sometimes excluded from the actual data set. And so it's not to say that these students are outliers, but since I don't know how many, Colby College does this as well. They immediately go to the wait list before May 1. So they send all these kids wait list in decisions. And then within a week, sometimes at Chicago, within 2 days, they start taking people off the wait list. So their whole intention might have been actually to drill down those admit numbers or admit rate numbers when they had full interest of admitting these students off the wait list anyways, or full interest in admitting the students in the first place. So anecdotally, the yield rate would be high from what I know, given that nearly everyone, or not everyone, but the vast majority of acceptances at University of Chicago either come in the early decision rounds Maybe the early action rounds, certainly not in the regular decision round, which is where it's very tough to yield at that point because you're in regular decision. Now, if you get into UChicago in the regular decision round, you probably also got into their peer institution. So they might lose out to someone like a Harvard or a Duke or an MIT. But if their enrollment strategy is essentially to take everyone through these sort of binding mechanisms or, almost 100% certainty of yielding them, it would make sense to me that their yield rate is very high.
Yeah. And I immediately thought of having Julie answer this question because two of us have had this conversation before. So Chicago has publicly released data to say that in the regular round, their admit rate is under 1%. Mm-hmm. They have shared that before. So, they're clearly signaling to people, don't apply regular. Right away you see that. And we've seen that, right? One of the most extraordinary students that I worked with this last year got in pretty much everywhere in regular. He got in the super hard get-in schools in regular, flat out denied Chicago in regular.
Yeah, sounds right.
Yeah. So that's going to elevate your yield rate. But one thing Julie and I have talked about a lot is how quickly they will go to a wait list. Mm-hmm. Now, when a school goes to a wait list really quickly, what that often means is there's a kid they really wanted, but they didn't want to take a chance that they wouldn't come, and they would lower the acceptance rate. Mm-hmm. So a lot of times what schools do with the wait list is they put out feelers to see whether or not you'll come. And if you don't respond to the feeler, then you don't go into the statistics.
Yep.
So the only way, that's what we sometimes call ED3. Mm-hmm. Right? So it's a way for schools to get kids they want without having their admit rates go down, knowing that a lot of people are looking at admit rates. Mm-hmm. They look at admit rates like they look at SAT scores and rankings as one of the metrics they use to create pecking orders. Whether that's fair or not, this is just the reality. And colleges are conscious of that. So a lot of schools are very, very careful. And I did a whole podcast maybe a few months ago on how Vanderbilt's top priority was to get their admit rate up to 65%, and how they had hired a top person from Chicago to come over and sort of show them some Chicago style tactics to get that admit rate up and their yield rate, not admit rate. I think I said admit rate. I meant to say yield. And it's working for them. They had a year where they dipped down to 49, and then they're right on. It was a 3-year goal to get to 65, and they look right on pace to hit it. Mm-hmm. Using certain tactics. So, and if you're really new, if you're just admitting an early decision that tends to have about a 98% matriculation rate, you'd say, why is it not 100? Well, there's always a few people that slip, and we talked about that a little bit in my interview with Matt Bonser from Colorado College. Why is it not 100%? But it's extraordinarily high, in the high 90s. So you have 2 rounds, ED1 and ED2, and then you're effectively using ED3 by waitlisting some people you want and then going really early to the wait list before others could give them offers, and you're not really in a competitive situation with other schools. Mm-hmm. And once again, not really counting them if you don't get if they blow you off or they don't give you the response you want, they don't go into the stats. So those are all things. So there's a third thing I learned, Julia, and I can't believe I didn't know this.
Yeah, I'm excited.
Did you know that 2 things? Did you know that UChicago gives merit money?
I had heard, and I thought a cool unicorn, but not in my experience have I seen that.
So I did not know that. And I was just shocked I didn't, but they give merit money. And so this is what I learned. I learned that they give merit money. So listeners, most of the most highly competitive schools don't give merit money, right? And especially those in the East Coast, pretty much none of your highly competitive, you can't be in the Ivy League, most of the NESCAC conference, Swarthmore, Haverford, Georgetown, they don't give merit money. And then your Stanfords and Pomonas don't give money. Northwestern doesn't give merit money, but most of the country does. And in the South, it's very common. The Vanderbilts, UNCs, Dukes, Emory's, they have it, but it's very hard to get. So Chicago doesn't give a lot of merit money. Their top awards are about $20,000. Most of the time, it's 5 to 10. But this is what I learned. So I didn't know they gave merit money. I was shocked to be for the first of all. But here's what I really learned. I wanted to know how they give it out. A lot of how they give it out is if somebody appeals.
Ooh, so they're trying to yield them.
Correct.
Ooh, and steal them.
So we used to do this at Westtown. Sometimes people that didn't have a financial need would apply for money.
Yes.
And then our director would be like, she would say, throw them a bone. And a bone meant 5,000. If that's what they, like, there's just that person that just wants to feel like they won something.
Yep.
And she would say, just throw them $5,000. Let's just get it over with and bring them in. And she'd be a little frustrated that this family's loaded and we're giving them $5,000, but it is what it is. So Chicago admitted to me that they will use them when people appeal in like competitive financial situations. That is going to increase your yield because a lot of the other competitors are going to say, no, the award is what it is. We're not changing.
Totally.
And they have the ability to be, okay, what is it? You know, like philosophically, when you go to merit, now you have the ability to wheel and deal a little bit.
Right. Exactly. Yeah.
And this is what Vandy's doing. And then the other thing that you mentioned, which is really important, is you talked about how they waitlist a decent amount. So schools have stats. They know that if they waitlist an early decision 1 or 2 applicant, they know that person is much more likely to yield because at one point they were willing to make a binding commitment to you.
Yep.
So a lot of times they may waitlist a kid that maybe wasn't quite a standout in the early pool, but maybe they want to see the entire pool. And now that they see it, they realize, okay, we could use that other person. And this is the same thing Vandy's doing too, is they admitted it. Like, we're waitlisting more and going and taking those waitlist kids that we waitlisted in the early decision round, they do yield at a high rate. So those are just some of the strategic things. And then let's face it, they do have a strong brand. Like, you couldn't get away with this if you were not a school that didn't have the strength of the brand that they have and the resources that they have.
Right.
You know, I'm trying to decide what I want to do about some of these schools I visited that we've already done spotlights on, but I want to share a few nuggets from them. But one thing I learned besides that on my U Chicago visit, they have more paid research opportunities than they have undergraduate students.
What? All
yes.
right. Listen,
yes.
I don't usually have to make a case for Chicago, but now I got mine for another place, perhaps.
Yeah, $5 billion endowment for undergraduate research, and they have like something like 8,000 to 9,000 paid spots. So they're working with a lot of things, you know, in their deck. I mean, the campus is just spectacular. Of course, I'm a sucker for the Gothic style architecture with the limestone. I love that.
Beautiful.
It's just beautiful. People like to be in cities. You know, there's lots of other things. I won't recount all of the things that they have, you know, they have going for them. But I don't want to make it sound like it's just pure gimmickry and they're not. You know, something that surprised me? I also had a conversation with them about sort of who they win and lose against in their overlaps.
Yeah.
Do you know they said who would you think they lose in their overlaps to, and versus who they would beat?
I think Columbia. I know Harvard is a particular thorn in the side for our U Chicago rep because that's what he'll lose. Brown is also one I see anecdotally, but I think because of Columbia's core and along with their location. But I do know with like the D plan as well, that's where Northwestern and Dartmouth can also be attractive, like U Chicago in terms of their curricular structure. But those would be my guesses.
It's a really good guess. They told me that they lose to Harvard, Yale, Columbia, and Stanford.
And
this year they beat Brown with their overlaps.
Hey.
And they don't, I didn't ask about MIT. They may lose there, but they pretty much, those are the 4 schools that they lose to.
Yeah.
And
I believe
so
that.
they're winning a lot of competitive battles. Now, some of it is all these strategies, but some of it is also that they have a lot to offer.
Right.
And they don't have tons of Northwestern overlap as much as you would think.
Good. Yeah. Well, that's awesome. To me, it's also a very particular place to be.
Correct.
So I'm glad that people are making informed decisions instead of just going by the brand and the name, rather.
Yeah, I've never attended an information session where they started out by breaking us up into small groups. And then they said, I want to get this right. Would you rather be a 150-foot duck or 50 flying ducks or some craziness like that? We had to debate that.
Yeah. It's very
and then the mission officer said that was her. She said that when she was a student, one night they spent 90 minutes debating that on the dorm floor.
Yeah, that sounds right. Yes.
Yeah. And then I've had 3 University of Chicago admission officers now tell me that if you don't like our college-specific questions, then you're probably not a match for us.
Exactly. That's what our rep says all the time. And I say that to my students who are always struggling with their supplements. And I'm like, then this is not if you do not like any of this is not a good fit for you. Do they listen? Not always, but.
Right. But I think that they do a really good job, I think, of being distinctive enough that they suss out those who are drawn to them, like between the core curriculum and their questions, they're deeply philosophical questions. They're not the athletic rah-rah school.
Right.
At all. So, that person would go to Northwestern or Duke or Michigan.
Yeah.
And so all of those things, I think, also actually help contribute to their yield. So we should say that too.
Yes.
I think they do a good job of being distinctive enough.
Yep.
And I'm going to say more about this another time, but that information session I attended was one of the best ones that I've attended in a long, long, long time.
I believe
they did a really good job of saying, here's who we are, here's who we are not. And that's also a good way to help your yield. Like if you're doing a good job articulating who you are and not trying to be all things to everybody, then you'll attract the right kind of applicant who wants what you have to offer.
Exactly.
So I have to give them credit for sort of being comfortable in their own skin and not trying to put on pretense and sort of being, this is who we are, and then drawing that right kind of student. So that's it. So Julia, the other question that Lee from NorCal, which is Northern California, by the way, for you non-Californians, the other question Lee from NorCal had is, should families be factoring yield into college list building, or how should data about yield impact their college list? What would you say about that? It's a great question.
It is. I would say that when it comes to really selective places, that especially if they don't measure demonstrated interest, that yield is probably not a huge thing to pay attention to, just because one of my favorite experiences I ever had was a student who gave me their college list. We let the students come in first, and I said, what's a reach? What's a possible or target, and what's a likely. And the student had actually looked at yield data. And so for them, a reach was Harvard, a target was Columbia, and a likely was Dartmouth. I was like, oh, no. It doesn't work like that. Just because Harvard's, quote, more popular or more likely that someone says yes when they get in does not mean that you have better chances. Especially if a school doesn't measure demonstrated interest. It either does that for equity reasons and or because they know they like you and they might very well yield you. So I wouldn't necessarily at the most selective schools use that as use yield data as a tool, but I would say where you could probably dig in on maybe some medium selective or selective in the sense that maybe they admit over 60%. is that if you have a lot of students that apply from your school or your area and no one goes, that might have something to say. Either the college might really, we have a bunch of colleges that really like my high school, for example, and so they're really happy to admit our students, even if they don't yield them, and they just hope to actually admit more. So that way they statistically, they might get one and then build up a list. And then I have some colleges that say like, no one's going to come here. And so they might waitlist my student. And I think that's more of a phenomena of the independent schools where we can have these conversations between colleges and counselors. But really where yield might matter is that if a school is not very selective, then their yield might not be really high. And so your chances might be better in the sense that they're casting a wider net because their yield is not as high as uber selective places. But I would say among the selective schools and uber selective that I wouldn't necessarily use yield data as a tool to determine, this one might be a little more in reach versus another one.
So I probably have a slightly different take on a few different things on that. We just come on here and talk. We just give you our opinions, and we don't plan ahead of time, so we can just be authentic. So a few things I would say. So the public has a tendency to look at acceptance rate as one of the things that indicates to them how hard a school is to get into, right? You see a school that has a 8% acceptance rate versus an 88% acceptance rate, that's going to be a lot harder to get into. And we know that acceptance rate can be manipulated, but not really to those extremes. So when you see wide disparities like that in acceptance rates, there's usually some truth to it. The schools with the really low acceptance rates are going to be harder to get into. So the thing about yield is actually a better measure of brand strength than acceptance rate, right? So the schools with the biggest brands will always have the highest yield. Harvard and Stanford go back and forth every year for number one, and now Chicago with some strategies which we've talked about is kind of in that conversation, but they're also a huge brand as well. And so what I would say is if you're building your own college list, couple things. When you see a school with a really high yield, and especially if it does also have a low acceptance rate, you just need to know that's going to be really, really hard to get into.
Yep.
It's going to be really, really hard to get into. Now, our real attentive regular listeners will remember I threw out an admissions vernacular a while ago called the draw rate. And this is a term that John Bockenstead has, I don't know if he pioneered it or if he's popularized it, but it basically takes your yield and it divides it by your acceptance rate to see who really has the strongest brands. So, for example, if Stanford has an 80% yield, which it really has consistently had up until the pandemic, and let's just say a 4% acceptance rate, you divide 4 into 80, you get 20. And that's the draw rate. Schools with the highest draw rates are going to be very, 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 very hard. The nice thing about that is the person that's manipulating their acceptance rate data, they're going to pay for it on the yield side. So they get exposed in that calculation. So the other thing I would say about yield, and this is probably more important, not so much on the most selective schools, but on the less selective schools, the lower the yield, especially for private schools, usually the more demonstrated interest is going to come into play. I know Julie agrees with me on that,
Yes, yeah.
So if you're working with a school that's, that has a 15% yield or a 20% yield, they have to take 5 to get 1 or 7 to get 1. It's going to matter a lot to them if you're willing to commit or if they think you're coming.
Yes.
So there is a correlation usually between how much demonstrated interest plays a role and the yield, particularly for private schools. A lot of times public schools, they're not thinking that way or operating that way. Sometimes it's because of the size of their staff. Sometimes it's because they're public mission. They just don't feel that it's fair to be making those determinations. and we have to be really careful here because Ju and I both know of public schools that do use demonstrated interest. And the trend line is for more public schools to, in a lot of ways, to start thinking like privates. One on this and also just other things related to revenue. So the trend line is, so we can't just say public schools don't use demonstrated interest, private schools, it's not that simple. But in general, most private schools with low yields, it's going to be a pretty big deal when they think somebody is coming.
Right.
And so to me, the biggest thing would be more on the lower yield schools, recognizing, okay, I better have a lot of engagement if I see a lower yield here.
Yes.
But
yes.
It's also tricky because you have that middle group that is still selective, but they're trying to climb. I call them the climbers. They're not happy where they are in the proverbial pecking order. So some of them, like at a place like Tulane, which we've talked about at length, like some of the ones, there's some of the more northeastern, like these are some of the schools that we have some of the sharpest elbows out here.
Yep.
Because they're maybe ambitious and maybe they still are not quite where they want to be in the pecking order or pantheon of colleges.
Yeah.
So,
Case Western, I would add to that.
Case, I would absolutely. Yeah, they are absolutely on that list, one of the leaders. So, and these are really selective schools. So just a couple of things, lower the yield, the more interest is going to play a role. When you see super high yields, like that's pretty much going to be what we would call a reach for all school.
Yep.
And there's a zillion names for it, to call them highly rejectives or lottery schools. I mean, there's millions of names out there. But if you're doing your list building on your own and you have too many really high yield schools, you might be in for a rude awakening. Or at least I'm not saying that not to have them because we have people that somebody's getting into these places. So some people do get in, but you have to do a really good application and simultaneously not actually expect to get in.
Exactly.
And that's not easy because, if I don't expect to get in, well, I mean, just go through the motions. No, yep. You have to do a really good application, but you can't expect to get in. And I know that might sound negative. Everybody has a tendency to think their student hung the moon.
Yes.
But guess what? Other people's kids hung the moon also.
Yep. Or as my Rod Skinner, my former boss, if everyone's special, then no one's special.
Yes. Is everyone special? Then no one's special. So I thought that was a really great question that really made me think. How should yield play a role in list building and that's a great website. We did a recommended resource on the website that Lee mentioned recently. So check it out.
And now this week's interview with a special guest.
Hi, this is Lynda, co-host on Your College Bound Kid, and today I am very excited to be talking with Ben Neely, Chief Research and Impact Officer at Revolution Prep. Now, we've actually had someone from Revolution Prep on before. Jake Newberg, the founder, was on the podcast back in 2018, interview number 16, and he was talking about the benefits of online tutoring and oh my goodness, have things changed in the past 5 years? Because now online is the norm. You don't have to do any convincing of anyone about it. But today you're going to talk about the digital SAT because online is so common. So Ben, if you would share a little bit about yourself, your background, your role at Revolution Prep, and how you got started in this industry.
Absolutely. Thanks, Lynda. So I guess my first start in the admissions testing world would have been the late 1990s when I was an undergrad at UC Berkeley. I took a part-time job as an SAT and ACT tutor for Kaplan. I'm sure you've heard of Kaplan, and tutored for them for 2 or 3 years. And after graduating, I was a high school math teacher for a couple of years and then made my way into educational services in 2005, not with Revolution Prep at that time. It was another firm, but pretty similar to Revolution Prep and how we work. I then met Jake Newberg, the former podcast guest, in 2009 and jumped over to Revolution Prep at that point. And you mentioned my current role where I am speaking at conferences and researching and learning and trying to help parents and students and college counselors make sense of really what's going on. Prior to that, I've had a really wide range of roles, everything from curriculum development, product development, hiring and managing tutors, and kind of our pedagogy and how we work with families, including at some point then managing our software engineering team as well to make sure all of our dashboards for students and teachers were doing what they need. So really a true generalist, I guess you could say. I've done a lot of different things. And you mentioned a little bit about Revolution Prep, but it's a really innovative place and has stood out for me in terms of our sort of fearlessness and our willingness to try new things in the service of helping every student.
I love that. I love that. And I kind of like that generalist view, that Swiss Army knife kind of persona. I like that. So talking about the digital SAT, because this is a topic, especially for seniors, the class of 24, there's a lot of questions around it because, you know, we're right in that transition phase. Can you tell me first, like, is this a natural evolution for the College Board for it to go digital? Because ACT is still paper, and I haven't heard that they have plans, but I could be misinformed. So do you know why they've decided to go digital now?
Yeah, I do. At least I have a pretty good sense. And so I'll start by saying I'm not employed by the College Board, the folks who make the SAT and PSAT, never have been. And in fact, I would say historically, I've been, I'd say, reasonably critical of the College Board at times. So I'll give you that sort of that base layer before giving my comments. I think they've wanted to do this for a long time, is my sense. They have been kind of hinting at it as early as the late 20 teens. The challenge, I think, for them was they had to wait for this idea of engaging with a test online to become more mainstream. And I think in some ways, the COVID-19 pandemic was the accelerator. The other sort of thing, and we can dive more into this later, was they needed to make sure that every student could have reasonable access to a device in order to do this. I think in 2015, 2016, if they rolled this out nationwide as a mandatory format change, which they are doing, you would have had real concerns about populations of students that wouldn't have access to devices. And I think one of the silver linings of COVID-19 was you had schools and districts investing more in their hardware, their infrastructure around computing. So that was, I think, one thing. The why of it for College Board, I think there's three main pillars. I think one is they have known for a long time now that a nearly 4-hour long paper and pencil test is increasingly not exciting for your average high school student. I don't think it ever has been. It's an understatement.
Yeah.
Yeah, I know. And so I think they've been looking for ways to have it appeal more. That again was brought into an acute need for them when COVID hit and we saw the really significant migration of colleges and universities to no longer requiring the SAT or ACT. And so I think it became more urgent for College Board to do something to make the test less unappealing. I won't say more appealing because it's never going to appeal to a teenager, but less unappealing. And so I think that's probably the single biggest factor is by making it digital, they're able to shorten it significantly. And I do think putting it on a computer is a native habitat for your average 15, 16, 17-year-old. If there was one other lesser reason, it would be test security. They have had, College Board, has had a few notable incidents with test security, predominantly internationally outside of the United States, where some bad actors have gotten hold of test questions and have leaked them onto social media or other sharing sites. They've charged students for access. And what that has led to is a bunch of hassle and bad PR for College Board. They've had to cancel the scores for entire countries certain times, which is obviously really unfortunate if you're one of the many, many students who didn't cheat, that your score was then canceled. So that's a lesser reason, but I do think that is part of this as well. This new format is a lot easier for them to keep secure.
Well, let me ask you about that because
Yeah.
if I feel like, I'm always getting emails, and this is probably going to tell you I need to up my password game, that, a particular site has been breached. So is this really more secure? I mean,
Yeah, I think the answer is yes. And what I'll say, I'll caveat that by saying we know that when it comes to technology, it is a myth to think that something can be 100% secure. We've seen ransomware attacks on everything from school districts to banks to healthcare systems. So I think nothing is truly immune. But for me, they're using pretty best in class encryption, standard encryption on the traffic that is going back and forth between their servers and the testing site. The nature of this new digital test is one that students are no longer seeing the same questions in the same sequence as they currently do. So even the most old school of cheating, looking at your neighbor's test, is no longer an option. And I think it's worth, if you think about the opportunities for security attack, if you want to think about it that way, on the current paper test, the reality is the site has to be shipped the test forms in advance. And while they do take some measures to secure the boxes and so forth, it's not that hard to envision somebody opening it up early and taking pictures of test questions. Whereas in this new world, none of the proctors or school administrators or test site administrators will have any access to the actual material of the test. It's all going to be going securely to the student's browser. So while it's not perfect and inevitably there's going to be some issue with it, it seems to me like actually a pretty good step forward in security.
okay. All right. I'll buy all of that. So if you would, give us a kind of a broad overview of the differences between paper and the new online version.
Absolutely. And I'll do this to start with the digital SAT and PSAT. And then as a contrast, we can talk about the ACT, which actually does have a sort of new digital format that I'll explain, but it's not the same as SAT.
Okay.
So the broad changes are it is mandatory digital. So starting in October of this year for the PSAT, and then starting in March of 2024 for the SAT, it is a hard switchover from a paper format to a digital format. So you can no longer choose paper. It's if you're going to take the SAT or PSAT on those timelines, it's got to be digital. It is delivered on each student's own device, whether that's their personal laptop or they have access to a school issued device like a Chromebook or another laptop. The test is shorter. I think that's the biggest headline. It's about a 30% reduction in length, possibly even a little more because of some new efficiencies in the proctoring process. Small example, but on the current paper and pencil test, the proctor asks every student to bubble in every single letter of their first, middle, and last names and the name of their high school and all of that. None of that is needed in the proctoring process anymore. It's already all done.
Thank goodness.
So yes, I know. I remember doing. I should say, another disclosure. I've taken the official SAT 5 times as an adult, so I personally have a lot of very unnecessary experience with bubbling in those sheets. The actual testing time is going from about 3 hours down to 2 hours and 14 minutes. But like I said, I think there's even more gains in time saving from some of the proctoring and the breaks experience. So what we're talking about is going from nearly a 4-hour experience when you think about the getting started and the breaks and everything else down to about a 2.5-hour experience. So I think that's the biggest headline. The other, I think, second biggest headline is that in order to get to that time shortening, they have made this test adaptive, which means that for every student, not only are they going to see different individual questions than the student sitting next to them, their test is actually going to change as they take it. So if they're doing well, the test is going to adapt to be a little bit harder. And if they're doing poorly, relatively speaking, the test will adapt to get a little bit easier. And that is a necessary change in order to shorten the test. So they wanted to shorten it. And this is the research proven way that you can rework a test in order to have it be just as accurate, but significantly shorter. So that's the sort of second big thing. And we can dive into that in more detail. And then I would say the last thing is, because it is digital, it's on a computer or on a laptop, there's access to technology tools, which are simply different than you would have if you had pencil and paper. So you can now use, a mouse to highlight or annotate or flag a question that you want to skip and come back to later. There's a built-in graphing calculator. Every student has their own timer in the application. They're not trying to crane their neck to look for the nearest clock on the wall. So some of those things I think we kind of take for granted in our day-to-day internet usage or computer usage, but really have not been available in that same way for paper and pencil admissions tests until now.
Let's take a break to learn about Mark's recommended resource for the week.
Friends, as we mentioned earlier, something a little different today. We're doing our recommended resource on Monday instead of Thursday. That's because there's an opportunity on Wednesday, August 16th, we do not want you to miss. If you're a regular listener of our podcast, you know my favorite economist is Roz Chetty, the brilliant economist who left Stanford to go to Harvard to join as the director of the Opportunity Insights. So what's going to happen on the 16th at 11 is that Roz Chetty, director of Opportunity Insights, a Harvard University institute that studies barriers to economic mobility in the U.S., will be sharing his research. He'll be joining the Washington Post Francis Steed Sellers to discuss his new study on admissions at elite universities. And if you've been listening to the last few Thursdays, Julie and I did a part 1 and a part 2 on this. But Raj is going to go into his research, and he's going to talk about what the research reveals about social mobility. And so if you're interested in this, we've got the link in the show notes. It's Wednesday, August 11th at 11 a.m., and it's our recommended resource for episode 352. And I get excited about these little things. Our first recommended resource ever on a Monday podcast.
So a couple of things. One, really excited about the clock being built in. I can remember sending my daughter off, like, you can't, take your phone or an Apple Watch or anything like that. And trying to find an analog watch in the house was a challenge. And not necessarily having to buy those graphing calculators.
Yeah.
So that has to be nice for parents.
Absolutely. Now, I will note students who do already have a graphing calculator, and I think my observation, so my oldest son is a rising junior, so this is right up his alley, this whole change. His friend group tends to split into one part, which he's a part of, which is barely uses his TI-83 and knows how, and then the other half that are like expert users and they have it all dialed in. So for those students, they can still absolutely bring and use a physical graphing calculator on the digital format tests. But I think for a student who doesn't have that sort of, I love my graphing calculator, I think it's best for them to just learn how to use the one that's built in now. It's called Desmos. It's actually not made by College Board. They licensed it, and it is the world's most popular free web-based graphing calculator. It's a really good one.
So students can practice with that beforehand, so they don't have to see it for the first time.
Absolutely. Yeah. Desmos.com. You don't even need to create an account. You just jump on, and in one click, you can use the exact same interface that's going to be on the official digital SAT and PSAT.
Great. Thank you. Now, the adaptive testing, and is that for all sections of the test? Is that just for the math? Talk about that.
Yeah, so the adaptive is for both halves of the test. So to give a little bit of basic layout, you've got what I'll call the math section. They have fancier names for these sections, but it's the math section, the verbal section, where the verbal section encompasses both reading comprehension as well as some questions that pertain to conventions of written English and grammar. That's all in the verbal section. So for each of those two halves of the test, they are both adaptive. And without going on too much of a nerd journey here, bear with me. Let me give you the basics of what they're doing here. So I think actually I would imagine some of the folks listening to this podcast have taken a computer adaptive test. If you've taken a graduate test like the GRE or the GMAT in the last couple of decades, they have been adaptive. Typically, an adaptive test actually changes every single question. So as you're answering questions, the test engine is saying, oh, you got that one right. Let's make the next one a little harder. Or if you got it wrong, let's make it a little bit easier. They're not doing adaptive that way for the digital SAT and PSAT. And the main reason is they wanted students to still be able to skip a question and come back to it later. These are 15, 16-year-olds. They felt it was unfair to force them to answer every question in order, which you got to do if you are question by question adaptive. So instead, they're doing something called section adaptive. So within the math, they've taken the 44 questions in total on the digital SAT or PSAT, and they've split them into two 22-question modules. This is their term, not mine. They're module. And for that first module, everybody gets the same difficulty. It's kind of an average difficulty, some easy, some medium, some hard. And at the end of that first 22 questions, which is timed, feels just like a regular test section. Based on the student's performance on that first section, they're either going to get a harder version of module 2 or an easier version of module 2. So the next 22 questions, they're going to take a fork in the road, and it'll either be the harder version or the easier version. And that's how they're doing adaptivity on this test, not question by question. And I think for most students, I think it's a little bit tricky when we give advice to students and their parents about this digital transition. It is tempting to hide all this information from them. And I don't usually like to say that, but the reason I might is the last thing you would want is for an anxious teen who is worried about the consequences of how well they do and everything else. And in general, again, just doesn't enjoy high stakes testing because almost nobody does. It's tempting to almost not introduce yet another thing that they might worry or obsess about, right? Oh, did I do well enough on that first module? Is this the harder version? Is this the easier version? But our stance is it's worth educating students on what they can expect so that they're not caught off guard in case they suddenly start to perceive that, wow, these questions have gotten harder now or they've gotten easier. But once they're aware of it, we would then implore them to focus on staying present, staying mindful in the moment with each individual question and trying to not even think about it. I mean, the test doesn't show them whether they've been sent to the harder version or the easier version. It's all opaque. It's kind of behind the scenes. And so our advice to students is, become aware that this is how the test works and then kind of forget about that when it's time to take it. Just dive into each question as it comes.
Well, that was my question was, are they going to know? Because I can see how that would be, oh, great. I got the easy path. So I'm, goodbye to my dream school right now. So they don't have any idea. The only way they would be able to tell is if they perceive the questions to be getting more difficult.
That's exactly right. And what I will tell you, we developed our own, at Revolution Prep, we developed our own replica testing engine that mirrors exactly what the College Board's application looks like. And so we've now helped thousands of students and schools do some practice testing in the last 6 to 8 months. And one of the things we've observed is that exact phenomenon you just identified, which is we have seen students where they finish the first module, they get to the second one, and then they say, oh man, the first couple questions seem easy. Darn, I'm not sure that this is going to do it for me. I think I did poorly. When in reality, they actually were sent to the harder module, but even the harder module has a couple of easy questions at the start. So this is where we're really trying to get students to step back, don't worry about that and just focus on each question as it comes.
So if they do get on the easier path, is there a ceiling as to what they can score on the test?
There absolutely is. The way the adaptive scoring works, it's going to take both that first module and the second one, which in the example you gave, let's say they do the regular first module like everyone does, and then the easier second one. The other thing that's happening, and I won't go down the nerd journey on this one because there would be way too much, is they're doing a different kind of scoring methodology that weights questions differently. And that is a departure from the current paper and pencil test, where even the hardest math question or the hardest verbal question is worth the same raw points as the easiest on the current paper SAT and ACT. On this digital test, they have a more sophisticated scoring algorithm that is going to weight things differently. So that student who got the easier module now has many more easy and medium questions and not so many hard questions. And because of that weighting, they will not be able to contribute as much to their overall score. Now, I will say it is really easy to take that word ceiling and misinterpret what it means. I've had some parents say, this seems really unfair, or it seems daunting that my daughter might just barely miss the cutoff for going to the harder second module and she gets sent to the easier one. And now they've put a limitation on her. No matter how well she does on that second section, she's not going to go above, and I'll give you the score. It's about a 600, give or take, is realistically where if you get sent to that lower module, there's really no world in which you're going to score well above about a 600 or a 610. That's going to be the limit. And I think it's easy to misconstrue that as unfair. The reality is, if you think about the sorts of students who on the paper SAT would be likely candidates to score in the high 600s or the low to mid 700s, that student is going to have, generally speaking, no problem clearing the hurdle on that first module and getting sent. It's like not going to be close. They're going to answer plenty of questions right. The kind of student who would likely be on the fence where, depending on how much sleep they got or how good they were feeling that day, they're right on that borderline. That's the sort of student who's likely scoring in the mid to high 500s on the current paper test anyway. So it isn't like this is some kind of a bear trap that's closing around the legs of students who would otherwise score a 700 and now they don't have access to that. The College Board has done a bunch of field testing on this. I think they've had something like 15,000 students take both the current paper format and a digital format test within 30 days. And they've found kind of remarkable consistency with how students are scoring on both tests in aggregate.
That is reassuring.
Friends, this concludes the first part of our 3-part interview. I hope you'll join us next week for part 2 of 3. Friends, on Thursday's episode, Vince and I will discuss an LA Times article entitled, "The Most Lucrative Majors. Some community college grads can out-earn elite university peers." Julie and I will answer a question from a listener. Comes from a college counselor, and she wants to know, can a student submit a poem about themselves instead of an essay about themselves for the personal statement? Wait till you hear what Julie and I have to say about that. How's that for a tease? Lisa will continue her outstanding interview with Evan Mandery in the final part in her interview about Evan's book, Poison Ivy. And we'll have a brand new college spotlight as Lynda recently visited the University of San Francisco. And Lynda and Lisa will talk about the University of San Francisco, the other USF. And that'll be a 2-parter, so part 1 of 2. And friends, I hope there's one thing that you'll remember that I say over and over and over again, and I'm going to say it again now. College is a match to be made and not a prize to be won. So approach your college search the same way you would if you're trying on a pair of shoes or a suit or a dress. You're looking for a custom fit. You're not just saying, what is the most expensive dress? What is the most expensive shoes? What is the most famous dress? What is the most famous shoes? You're saying, which one fits my body the best? See you on Thursday, friends. And that's our show. A big thank you to you, our listeners, for tuning in this week. If you find this podcast helpful, please follow us and you'll get every single episode as soon as it is released. If you're interested, there are a few ways you can really support our podcast. You can click the share button and send it to your friends and acquaintances. You can help us pay our staff and our expenses by donating on our website. You can write a review for us on Apple or Spotify. I'm the producer of the podcast, but but we have a fantastic team of 15. Shout out to our co-host, Dr. Lisa Ruff, Dr. David Williams, Lynda Depker, Susan Tree, Vince Garcia, and Julia Esquivel. And to our substitute co-host, Sylvia Borgo. Our sensational sound engineer is Nemanja Motvich. Our amazing music is from Victor Allen Weeks. Marketing designs are from Kimberly Blass. Lily Parikh manages our Instagram. Our image editor is Talha Khan. Joyce Ducker does our website episode updates. And our webmaster is Stalianos Dimitriou. And if you want to have a coaching session with Lisa, Lynda, or me, just text me at 404-664-4340. If you have a question you want us to answer, or if you have a recommended resource or article you think we should discuss, just send it to questions@yourcollegeboundkid.com. Our favorite method is for you to record your own voice at speakpipe.com/YCBK. By the way, check out our website, where you'll find lots of content that is not on any podcast app. Our website is yourcollegeboundkid.com. If you want to learn about other hot admissions topics, follow us on Twitter at YCBK Podcasts. We think of you as our listening family, and we look forward to meeting again with you every single Monday and Thursday.